Well, Stu, I thank you warmly for that very generous introduction, although I will point out that it has been quite some time since I was a Western Sydney girl. And these days, we're headed for east of Brisbane. Now, thank you one and all for your support of the Samuel Griffith Society tonight, and I'd like to echo the acknowledgements that have been done so well by my friend and colleague in Stu Wood. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for this evening. But John Anderson isn't somebody who needs an awful lot of introduction. Not every day you get to hear from a Deputy Prime Minister, and one who has not just served with distinction in the Parliament among the highest levels, but who has gone on in his post-parliamentary career to continue to play such an important role in shaping the way that Australians think about the very most important things of life and politics. I can't think of many other people who are having an impact remotely close to that which you are having in the present day, John, to helping people understand the dangers of cultural Marxism, the enduring value of our institutions and the history from which they stem, the fundamental rights and freedoms and the way that they stem from human dignity, that concept so beautifully emerging from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And of course, he provides all of the intellectual counterweights that we need to be able to defeat the harms of identity politics as they are being purveyed to Australians. Sometimes, as a person who aspires to serve your country, you look around to those in service, in the roles that one day you might hope to contribute to, and you cast your eye around for people that you might be able to emulate. And oftentimes, in the cut and thrust of the day-to-day, it's not obvious that you're among the kind of person around whom you might like to shape your character and your contribution. So some look to Churchill, others look to Reagan. The ladies, of course, look to Thatcher. You couldn't do better than Thatcher. But it is a rare and special thing to be able to have somebody whose integrity, whose intellect, and whose fundamental decency is something that can be looked up to, and to see that he is no less effective for bringing that decency into the public square. I am not embarrassed to say, John, that you are my political mentor. You're the person who I hope one day to emulate a couple of your attributes, and if I can even nail a couple of them, I'll consider myself a success. John, it is our great pleasure to invite you to address us tonight. Would you all join in welcoming John Anderson to the podium?
Amanda, thanks. That little exchange then was just Amanda saying, did I embarrass you enough? And I'm reminded that if my wife were here, she was hoping to be, but she's had a knee replacement and is still undergoing rehab. And I have to be back with her first thing tomorrow morning, so I can't spend more time with you. But she would say, John, just remember, you're only ever invited twice, the second time to apologise for the first. So hopefully we can manage a little better than that tonight. But can I say, distinguished guests and former colleagues and friends all, it is a deep honour to be here tonight. I deeply appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to make some remarks. Amanda's been very generous, but I actually don't think of myself as particularly clever, except to say to you that I have managed one great stroke of brilliance in my life. I chose my parents with great wisdom. They were Australian. What's more than that, they were country Australians, and I managed my timing fairly well. I am a mid-baby boomer. And I mention that because, in fact, my entry into the world was vastly delayed because both of my parents' lives were massively interrupted by the Second World War, to the point where they didn't marry until 10 years after it was over, when most of their friends thought they'd marry in the late 30s. So I escaped the horrors of war, too young for the Second World War, and of course too young as it happened just for Vietnam. But I grew up with a consciousness, not just because of the physical scars that my father bore. He was almost killed. In fact, he was given up for dead by the medicos in the second night of Monty's great pushback against Rommel in the North African desert. So he was incredibly badly mauled physically, not just because others would walk around him with a certain reverence, because they knew what he'd risked for freedom, but also because he was traumatised by that. Right up until the time that I married in my late 20s, he would wake sometimes in the middle of the night screaming, "Get down, you fool, you're going to get hit, get down," as he tried to drag the younger bloke, Dad would have been 23, the younger one about 18, back down into the trench as the Panzer found the range. He did have a few quips. He'd never talk about those horrors. I was only able to piece it all together after he died. One of the yarns, though, that I've always thought was quite telling was about the two blokes from the desert who finally got some leave, and they were put on a ship that was headed back to England. They got off the boat in Plymouth, and relieved just to be alive, they do what Australians in moments of great stress relief do. They headed as far as they could away from the ship and the reminders of war, got themselves completely written off. And at closing time, at 10 o'clock at night in an English pub somewhere in Plymouth, they're thrown out on the street. And one of the Aussies looks at the other and says, "Now, I know you're not very bright, and you're not going to be able to tell me the way back to the ship, and I can't, so that means we're lost." And his mate says, "Oh, it'll be all right with us, there's a bloke walking down the street. Just happens to be the Admiral of the fleet, and he's covered in gold braid and medals everywhere. Hey, mate, we don't know where we are. The ship's down there. So we don't know, but how do we go? Can you tell us where we are?" He pulls himself up to his full height and says, as only an Englishman can, "I say, you fellows know who I am?" And one of the Aussies looks at the other one and says, "Now we really are in trouble, mate. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is." And that's our culture now. Well, that's what we've come to. Can I tell you, I think we are at another civilisational moment. The external challenges that we face are massive. And as somebody who was deeply committed to economic reform in government, to the point where it's so nice to have Liberals saying nice things about me, because in those days, the great term of insult that was always thrown at me out in the bush was, "You're an eco-rat." And I said, "Would you like to be economically irrational?" And we get into all sorts of arguments. But I believe in sound management, sound money. I think Margaret Thatcher used to talk about it. You know, a great privilege to serve with some of you in this room, including, of course, Peter Costello, not with us, but a very dear friend. And that great job of cleaning up the deficits and then the debt. Those things matter. But if you look at the global outlook now, we've got no appetite for doing any of the hard work at all. And yet this country faces massive challenges on the economic and trade front, such that I note Paul Kelly warned in last week's Australian, and I'm not sure whose research it was based on, perhaps it was his own. We've already slipped from 11th to 13th wealthiest country on earth, of the mere population of 25 or 26 million. We're on our way to 23rd. And the trade headwinds out of the ending of globalisation by the Americans is one challenge. The arc of autocracy is as frightening, really, in my view, as what my father must have been contemplating in the 1930s. But they're just the external challenges. Then there's the internal challenges. One interesting little measure of it, I'm delighted to hear that there's so many young people here tonight. You're our future. I can't tell you how much it cheers me. I say this to young people when they come up to me and say, "We've listened to one of your podcasts, we can't get this at university, school, workplace. We just thank you for it." Every young person who says that cheers us on and makes us keep going. I was just saying on the table that even with 88 million views over 5 years, they still actually lose money. But we don't do it for money. We do it to try and provide good thinking for people who want to tap into it. And how fantastic that young people do. But can I say, if you're around 25, the world has changed unbelievably just since we were in government in the days that Amanda talked about when I was Deputy PM. The Wall Street Journal, which some people regard as perhaps the world's best paper, has recently quoted some very interesting research which shows that since 1998, unbelievably, the number of Americans who see patriotism as important has gone from 70% to 38%. The number of people in America, the most Christian nation of the Western countries at least, has gone, who think religion's important, has gone from 62% to 39%. The number of Americans to whom having children is important has gone in 25 years from 60% to 30%. So 2 out of 3 Americans don't think having children is important. The number of Americans who think money and fame are what life is about has doubled, and a little bit of related research showed that 75% of baby boomer Americans can say they're proud to be American, but only 16% of under 25s. Now that's America, but culturally, you know, we are part of, if you like, the Anglosphere. That tells you how deep the revolution has been. I asked Neil Ferguson, who would be the world's most prominent economic historian, I think, enormously prolific writer, a very deep thinker, what he thought the greatest threats to our freedoms were, and you can find this on my website. It's a few years old now, but he said, in ascending order, the possibility of a bad actor or an Islamic terrorist getting the bomb or weapons of mass destruction, followed by the second greatest threat, the possibility of miscalculation between the superpower and the rising superpower. But the greatest threat is that we reject our own history. We reject our own ideals. We reject the idea that we have built up a society worth defending. And I think there are deep insights in that. I've just seen that screen. That's quite big, isn't it? I'm always intrigued by screens. A few years ago, there's another one. I was asked to speak after the tsunami. Do you remember the tsunami? We put in $1 billion. John Howard was on leave at the time. I was on duty. And he rang me and he said, I think we should do something serious. And I said, so I do too. I've been thinking about this, especially post-Timor. And it's about solidarity, no cheap points. We just should do something that reflects our prosperity and their deep need at this moment. We both agreed it ought to be $1 billion. We then had quite a discussion about who was going to tell Peter Costello. But anyway, he was very, very generous and good-natured about the whole thing. But it did lead me to going up to Indonesia quite a bit when I'd retired, being involved in all sorts of very interesting projects related to the recovery. And at one stage, I got to know a businessman up there quite well, and out of the blue, I couldn't believe it. He was in Sydney, and he said to me, next time you're in Jakarta, will you come and talk at my church? And I thought, good grief, do you want me to talk at a church? I'm a former Deputy Prime Minister. This is an Islamic country. How's this going to work? I said, playing for time, if you run this idea by your head pastor, and he said, I am the head pastor. Well, anyway, I ended up in Jakarta, and on a Saturday morning, he took me around to where I was to talk to 6,000 people the next day in this massive, massive purpose-built new church. And I walked in, and to my horror, there was a screen. I mean, it was a screen. It was 10 metres by 40. And it had the church's logo over on one side, and then a picture of me taken from the internet, and a little Indonesian fellow had a good look at that and a good look at me. He came right up to me, peered at me through his glasses and said, just how old is that photo? I was looking in the mirror the other day. I said to my wife, oh, darling, gosh, it's depressing. I don't feel any different on the side, but I've gone silver. Everything's sagging, skin's falling away. Quick, say something to cheer me up. She said, I have noticed your eyesight's as good as it ever was. But the worry was on the remainder of the screen, you know, there's about 25 metres and by 10 metres of it left. Up the top, quite nicely, we welcome our guest. And then in the most massive writing I've ever seen, about 6 times the size of that, in bright blue is John Anderson. And then there's 2 little words, the fine print, you know, you never read until everything else goes wrong. The 2 little words are former and deputy, and then in massive writing, Prime Minister of Australia. And, you know, I took a photograph of it to take it back to Canberra, thinking I knew the Prime Minister in those days, and say, listen, old fellow, no one's told you, but there's been a coup. The problem is that by the time I got back to Canberra, there had been a coup. But back to my point about the change in Western society. David Brooks, God bless him, writing for the New York Times, but makes some very worthwhile contributions at times. He said he's never known Western society to be as divided, as atomised, and as distrustful as it is today. And I want to focus on that distrust for a moment because it's so important. When two or three are gathered, trust is there at the forefront, isn't it? If you trust the people you've been introduced to, you can move forward cooperatively and benefit greatly to the advantage of all. If you don't, you're looking for security, you're looking for safety, you're worried about how it might all work. Things break down. The ANU's been tracking trust in Australian political institutions, the federal parliament in particular, and players thereof. Sorry to those of you who are still in it. And since 1970, and it's been a bleak story. The Australian people trust their politicians less and less and less. There was a magnificent spike in 1996, and you would have thought it would have stayed up there, but, it didn't. And then there was another one, and that was when a certain good government was elected. And then in 2007, there was a certain bad government that was elected, and the spike in trust was even greater. But that time it collapsed completely. And then, Stuart, you touched on this in some remarks earlier, I think, or someone did. Jim, it was. During COVID, interestingly, there was another spike in confidence and trust when they thought the government will keep us safe. And guess what? That's fallen away. The long-term trend line is terrible. And you see it in our attitudes towards so many of our institutions. Trust has broken down, but worse than that, trust in the underlying beliefs and values that powered up our freedoms is also collapsing. Or in fact, we've moved into a position where we're openly hostile to our formative ideas, beliefs and values. And I think this is extraordinarily dangerous civilisationally. The reality is that all civilisations down through the ages, and there have been many of them, Arnold Toynbee reckoned he'd studied over 20, and they've all been powered by a great engine that's been fuelled by an ongoing commitment by people to that engine and its purposes. And in ours, in the very crudest and simplest broad brush ways, you can trace it through, really, in the West, from the Exodus model of covenantal governments by agreement on both sides, if you like, down through Magna Carta, the failed revolution in England, if you like, the gradual evolving of an understanding of the worth and the dignity of every individual through the freeing of the African slaves. How inconvenient that was led by a bunch of crusty, old, stale, white, male, privileged whatevers, but it was the greatest human rights movement of all times, and how inconvenient that the evil empire, the British Empire, had enough power then to stop everybody else trading in the misery of slavery. But leaving that aside, and then the American Revolution and indeed our own Constitution, producing freedom, producing prosperity, opportunities for people to live their best lives, in contrast to the other set of revolutions, if you like, deriving from the French. Let's never forget Karl Marx was an admirer of the French Revolution, and he set up a few of himself that have produced nothing but misery and oppression and death and horror. And now we're absorbing this model, this cultural Marxism model, call it what you like. You can call it the Gramsci Marxism, or you can call it the Foucault Marxism, or you can call it wokeism, or American, or Marxism with American characteristics. But it's very real, and it's still Marxism, and it still strikes at the heart of freedom. That word the Americans talk about a lot, but we need to focus on it as well because they are under challenge in a serious way. How might we understand freedom from a helicopter, from a bird's eye view? Well, I would start, I think, with Irving Berlin. No, Isaiah Berlin. I always do that. Mind you, I'm in good company. Churchill did it once, and they bought him. This happened apparently. They bought him Irving. And Irving said, "Would you like me to play the piano?" And he said, "No, I want to talk philosophy." He said, "You've got the wrong Berlin." Anyway, which he did. Rarely happened with Churchill, but sometimes apparently. And he had this concept of the two freedoms, negative freedom and positive freedom. And I find them so useful. What is negative freedom? It might be better described for an audience such as us who've had a nice dinner and what have you as freedom from, if you like, freedom from the negatives, the external and internal. Oppressive governments, being dragged away in the middle of the night to face a kangaroo court or sent to a gulag, but also the personal ones, addiction, anxiety, fear, bankruptcy, not being able to feed your family. And we'd all agree you want to be free of those terrible things. So they're the negative freedoms. But then there's the positive freedoms. And here's the point about the positive freedoms. All too often they're taken as license, and a license to be selfish. Rather than, as all the great thinkers down through the ages said, positive freedom, whether they've used that term or not, is about reaching your potential and doing what you ought. And many of the great thinkers, I think Templeton was one of them. He was the famous bloke. He was a great Hyde Park Speaker's Corner fellow. And he was carrying on one about the evils of drink. And there was a bloke in the crowd saying, "You're a religious man, what about that St. Paul? He liked a tipple, didn't he?" For those of you who remember your new scriptures, New Testament scriptures, Timothy advising Paul to have a little wine to settle his stomach. And Templeton said, "He liked to drink, didn't he?" And Templeton said, "Well, I don't know. When I get to heaven, I'll ask him." And the drunk called back, "And what if he's not there?" And Templeton replied, "Well, in that case, my good man, you can ask him." What a pity we've washed humour out of the system in Australian political life. But I want to expand on this idea that freedom misunderstood and turned into licence almost inevitably starts to impact other people's freedoms, and we're seeing a great deal of that today. And when freedom erodes other people's freedom, here is the rub. Freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. And so it is that I would say this idea that is emerging now of personal autonomy as the greatest virtue is in direct contrast to our cultural upbringing that we ought to treat our neighbour as ourselves, love our neighbour as ourselves. We all love ourselves. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto them. The golden rule, do no harm, is a watered-down version of it. But what is now morphing is one where the idea is that my body is mine, it is my property, I will do with it as I like, as though I'm disembodied and don't have to think about others. I feel, therefore I am. And this turns out to be quite profoundly, I should say, anti-community and family. It turns out to be quite anti-authority. It's fairly anarchistic. And it's also profoundly anti-religion in many ways. How dare a higher authority declare that I was made man or woman, for example. And in a way, the rub is that this is really producing a bitter fruit. We see it in the research. We see that the more obsessed we become with self and our own comfort and our own identity at the expense of those around us, the higher the levels of anxiety, of depression, of self-harm amongst our young people, particularly in Australia. I can't believe the figures. And two of my own children have been just recently deeply, deeply traumatised by good friends in their 20s taking their own life. And why? And how come this is acceptable? And why are we not doing more about it? And yet we cheapen the meaning and purpose of life so much that there's no purpose left for a lot of young people when the going gets tough, when they feel harmed or even worse, hurt. They think it's not worth carrying on. And in reality, this is a really important point. Jonathan Haidt makes it. He said, we're raising our children making 3 fatal mistakes. Well-intentioned, but fatal mistakes. We're telling them, always trust your feelings. Oh, ignore that sign that says there's crocodiles in these waters, it's a hot day, I feel like a swim and then I'll feel even better. We bring our children up to believe that life is a battle between good people and bad people. No, what about Solzhenitsyn? He rightly pointed out the dividing line between good and evil doesn't lie between man and woman, or free and slave, prisoner, or Catholic and Baptist, or black and white, but somewhere across every human heart. And the other great mistake that he points to is that we say to our children, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you weaker. So we helicopter parents, our children, and they have no resilience. And this is becoming a really big problem. What was that expression about every bird in the pet shop? Parrot in the pet shop, starting to talk about this lack of resilience and ability to really man up. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say that, am I? To sort of face up and grapple with the great issues of life. But I want to say to you too that the effects of this self-obsession, this exercising of your rights without regard for others, amounts to an abandonment of responsibility. And it is also producing a society where, because people will not accept their responsibilities, we've introduced, unbelievably to me, and many of you are lawyers, starting in the 1970s with the Sex Discrimination Act under Whitlam, this extraordinary, complicated architecture for protecting people's rights and ending discrimination, whereby, if you stop and think about this, it seems to be an important point to make, we compete with our fellow Australians for our rights. Well, what about cooperation? What about really treating your neighbour properly? What about doing it out of a willingness to respect others, the dignity and worth of all, a founding principle of our culture? And I would put it to you that that's what's behind the weakening of the 4 freedoms that make up the stool that is so important to our flourishing in a culture like ours. Janet Albrechtsen argues that free speech is the most important. It's the one by which we defend all our other rights. Frank Ferrudi, Professor of Philosophy at Kent University, Emeritus Professor, would say, no, freedom of conscience and belief are the fundamental freedoms. I would say, amen to both, but equally important is the right to freedom of assembly. I mean, if you stop and think about it, you can't exercise free speech if you don't have freedom of assembly. That's the whole intent of trying to make sure schools and charities can't hire people who believe in the creed and the beliefs of the institution that wants to hire them. The double standard here is breathtaking. Do you think Adam Brandt would take me on as a staffer with my views? Of course he wouldn't. He has every right not to. Well, why should schools and charities not have a similar right? And then, of course, there's freedom of property rights. We forget that one. They're 4 legs of a stool. Weaken any and you weaken them all. You really do. And we have not understood how they're an integrated package. And if you like, the freedom of property one is particularly important, the freedom to own property, whether it's your intellectual ability, so you can go and get a job as a software technician or whatever it is, or whether you're a farmer like me and you produce an extra bag of wheat and you want to sell it to somebody who's produced a sharp knife and you make a bit of profit and we've both done well, and next year I want 2 knives and he wants 4 or 5 bags of wheat from me, and that's how prosperity's been built. If you think some feudal overlord is going to come along and take it from you, well, we know what happened there. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe until the communist uprising, and then in the 20s and 30s, people starved because the farmers didn't know whether they'd be able to keep their product, so they stopped producing. Well, you would, wouldn't you? I remember Ronald Reagan getting off the plane once. He'd been to Soviet Russia, and the breathless press saying, "How was your trip to Russia?" "Well, I asked to be taken out to a collective farm, and the commissar took us out there, and we met the manager of the collective farm, and the commissar said, 'Comrade, how was the wheat harvest?' 'Ah, the wheat, there's so much wheat we can't store it. We've got it in our bedrooms and overflowing into our kitchens. We don't know where to put all the wheat.' 'And how about the potatoes?' This is Reagan, of course, potatoes. 'The potatoes, why? We've got so many, we've put them all in a pile and they reach up to the heavens.' And the commissar says, 'Comrade, we don't do heaven. There's no God.' And the farm manager says, 'Well, that's very fortunate, because there ain't no wheat or potatoes either.'" Reagan was brilliant at using that comedy. And I just make this other point on private property. Father Tony Percy's here tonight. We ought to be 100% behind him in his campaign in relation to the lifting of the ownership of Calvary Hospital in Canberra. Their property today and yours and mine tomorrow. And who will donate to the Calvary hospitals of tomorrow if they think their hard-earned donations can simply be removed at whim by a government? And the most concerning thing for me is that the Prime Minister of this country, a product of the economics department, mind you, it was the Marxist stream, political economy, at the University of Sydney, who can't see the importance of private property. Well, is there an end in sight? I hope so. I do note that a very serious thinker, a professor at Leuphana University in Lüneburg in Germany, Christian Weisel, was asked recently, can Europeans and Americans really go on getting ever more individualistic and secular? He said, people keep asking me if there's a limit, but I haven't seen any sign yet. He finds that his research indicates that in every region, each generation becomes more individualistic and secular than the one before. The response to that is best found, I think, in Roger Scruton's writings. I'm so sorry he's gone. What a mind. And I have to say, I'm very sad I never managed to get to one of these live-in camps for a week. They were called Scrutopia. I don't know, did anybody ever get to Scrutopia? No one? They must have been a real feast for the mind. But he made this comment about this terrible embracing of secular individualism to the degree that is killing not just individuals, but our societies. For us humans, who enter a world marked by the joys and the sufferings of those who are making room for us, who enjoy protection in our early years and opportunities in our maturity, the field of obligation is wider than the field of choice. We are bound by ties we never choose, and our world contains values and challenges that intrude from beyond the comfortable arena of our agreements. We need one another. The doctrine of the individual, so beloved of people like me who subscribe to the political values that so many of us hold dear, should never be a selfish doctrine. An individual can only flourish and reach his or her potential in the context of a working community and society, whether it's the smallest community, the family, or right through to the national level. Our civilization needs refueling. The alternative fuels we've been trying to run the engine on have it spluttering, coughing, it's very unhealthy. I don't know how many more knocks it can take, quite frankly. It desperately needs some high-octane, high-quality fuel. I salute everything that you have done in this organisation, amongst your friends, your colleagues, in the past, that you're doing now, and that you will do through your future younger members here. And again, I celebrate all of you, younger people. The engine needs refuelling. You're working to that end. Please refuel it as quickly and as much as you can. Thanks very much.